So we often get told of the things you should be doing after a run. Here are 5 things that you definitely shouldn't be doing after a run. My name is Shona Hendricks from CoachParry.com, where we make you fitter, faster and stronger. I'm going to hand over to Lindsey. He's going to give you the first one.
Thanks, Shona. The first thing you want to avoid is stopping dead. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So let me unpack that for you. But when you are running, and particularly when you're running hard, but this also goes for if you're just out on an easy run, but when you're running and running hard, our heart rate goes up, okay? And in response to the increasing demands of energy, the blood vessels and capillaries, they expand and open up, and that is to allow more blood to be pumped around with every beat of the heart, so that we can supply oxygen, so that we can supply energy, substrate, etc. What happens when we stop exercising is that it doesn't suddenly all just go back to how it was at rest. There is a gradual decrease in the heart rate going down, but there's an even more gradual decrease in the size of those capillaries and blood vessels. And so if you just stop dead right where you are, you run the risk of suddenly having your blood pressure fall through the floor, because as the heart rate, as your heart rate goes down, that blood pressure in the capillaries immediately drops, and it's in response to that those blood vessels and capillaries start to close. So never stop dead. Go into a gentle jog and then into a walk and keep moving around. There's also, again, this is more prevalent if you are doing harder runs, but it's still relevant when you run easy. There's also this need to just let everything settle down, because if you just stop dead and then stand there for a few minutes, like we do sometimes in a race situation, so if you think back to that, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Because of circumstances, you end up just stopping and standing still, and everything starts to seize up and tighten up, and suddenly when you then try and move, everything feels way more sore and uncomfortable than it should be. And if you just slow down gradually and walk for 300 or 400 meters after you've done any form of exercise, that's going to bring everything down slowly. It's going to allow the muscles, joints, tendons, everything to settle down, and you're going to feel much better as you start recovering and getting ready for the next workout.
The second thing that you want to avoid is to stay in your wet kit after exercise. The reason for that is, when you stay in that wet kit, you're susceptible to not only irritable rashes, folliculitis, and then even bacterial infection. After exercise, your body's run down because of the exercise, and because of that, there's a drop in your body's immunity. Even more so when your body temperature drops. These two things can cause you to get sick. So, get out of your wet kit as soon as you possibly can in order to avoid getting sick or your body temperature from dropping. So, how do we prevent this from happening? First up, if you're not running from home, it's best you just plan your outing a bit. Take a dry towel, a dry t-shirt, and even warm top. So after your run, if you can give your body a quick rub, get into the dry t-shirt and also a warm top for when your body temperature does go down. That's very important. If you run from home, give your body approximately 20 minutes before you take a shower, and within those 20 minutes, you can refuel your body and also rehydrate.
So the next thing to do, or the next thing rather to avoid, is waiting too long to get some refueling in post-run or post-training session. Now, we often fall into the trap. We've run, we get in the car, we want to drive home, and we've got this long window before we put anything back in our body from a fueling or nutrition point of view. This is absolutely imperative that you try and replace your nutrition or your fuel as soon as possible. Things sort of differ in different schools of thought, but generally you want to try and start replacing or getting food back in your body within a 15 to 30 minute window post-training session. Now, the reason for that is your body has depleted energy stores, your muscle glycogen stores have been depleted throughout your training session. Naturally, depending on the intensity of the training session will determine how much of that has depleted. But the idea of the refueling is really to resynthesize muscle. So we break down muscle, we need that muscle to start rebuilding back. Remember, the recovery phase is where we really start to build and adapt to the training that we've just done. And the nutrition is a very key point in getting that in and helping that muscle resynthesis post-training session. So what do we take in? There's often a little bit of confusion about the kind of food or the kind of nutrition that we need to take in post-training session. Protein-rich foods are going to be your first prize, so the protein is what helps with that muscle resynthesis. But it is also important not to forget carbohydrate intake. That's your fuel, especially for some of us who might be doing multi-day events or have a training session the next day. We need to start replacing and filling up that fuel tank as soon as possible after that run. So think carbohydrates, think protein intake, balanced food. Food is always going to be first prize. If you don't get food, then taking in a chocolate milk is always a very popular one. Or then a recovery shake if you don't have access or can't get food in really soon. It's easier to then take a recovery shake with you and just smash that quickly after your training session.
Thanks, Dev. You've given us the right thing to do after a run. One of the things that we shouldn't do, but I know that many of us do, is partake in an adult beverage after a run or a race, which is always exciting. But essentially what it does when we are consuming some sort of alcoholic beverage after a run is it really impairs your protein synthesis after a run. That's a very fancy way of saying that your muscles repairing after your run, the proteins don't get utilized well enough when you do drink alcohol. There's an interesting study that came out though that showed there are two groups. One group drank water and a beer, and the other group just drank a beer, and they essentially decided that one beer, so not a big 500 ml beer, but one 250 milliliter beer didn't impair in terms of dehydration and your muscle synthesis. So if you are going to partake in a post-run or post-race beer, I would say don't make it more than one, and you really want to ensure that you're getting the right sort of things that Dev has just spoken about in after your run.
Thanks, Shona. So if you've been boozing, then you shouldn't be driving at all. But one of the things you want to try and avoid after doing exercise is a long car trip. Now that isn't always practically possible, and some of us do need to travel fairly long periods after training or before training. So specifically when you're going to go on a long drive after training, don't go and climb into your car straight away. I know sometimes we're in a hurry, we need to get back to family, we need to get back to the office, but that doesn't do you any favors in terms of your recovery, and it really doesn't do you any favors in terms of your long-term mobility and keeping your hips free. As soon as you climb into that car, drive for a long period of time, your hip flexors and your quads in particular really tighten up, and your glutes, they deactivate, especially if you're not sitting properly. So after doing exercise and before climbing into a car, if you need to do a long car drive, really make sure that you cool down appropriately, do some very light exercise, some mobility drills, and do your dynamic stretches. And I would highly recommend that when you get on the other side of a long journey, that you actually repeat those steps so that you really can go into the next day feeling much better than you otherwise would. Very similarly, if you are driving a long way to get to a workout, it's extremely important that you are quite pedantic about doing some limbering up and dynamic mobility drills before you start running. If you want to know exactly what to do before a run, then click on the video on screen.